Adrian, thank you very much. And if you're just joining us, we'll start with that breaking news. There's been a breakthrough in a 3-year dispute between Qatar and 3 other Arab nations. Saudi Arabia has agreed to reopen its airspace and land and sea border to Qatar from Monday, ending the blockade on the state. Kuwait, which has been the main mediator in the dispute, made the announcement on the eve of a Gulf Cooperation Council summit in Riyadh. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt and Bahrain imposed a blockade on Qatar in 2017, accusing it of supporting terrorism. Qatar has always rejected the claim. Let's bring in Rami Khouri, who's the Director of Global Engagement and a Senior Public Policy Fellow at the American University of Beirut. He joins us via Skype from New York. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. So give us your reaction to the significance of this news.
Well, my reaction is good. I'm very pleased. This is good news. Whenever any kind of tensions between countries in the Arab region are resolved, then one has to be happy. The significance is not clear yet because this was a fake conflict from the beginning. The charges against Qatar by the 4 Arab countries were really quite outrageous, and most of the world saw them that way, and therefore very few people, if any, supported the boycott. This is a political dispute. There is a political dispute between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar and other countries about how to deal with political trends.
Rami Khouri, we seem to have lost our guest there. Just talking about also the influence of where this will take the Middle East and that whole region. Let's bring in Heidi Jo Castro, who's following developments from Washington, D.C. And Heidi, we've seen recently the normalisation of relations between some Gulf countries and Israel. Put this current development in the context for us.
Sure. The guiding principle between by this foreign policy team led by Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, has been to unite the countries in this region against Iran. And that is one of the driving factors was in the push to normalize diplomatic relations between Israel and several Arab nations that we saw occur at the end of last year. Now, he had also been working until the wee hours over the phones where, according to the reporting of the Reuters news agency, citing an unnamed U.S. Official, that Kushner was on the phones himself trying to negotiate this breakthrough and that it finally has emerged. I know a big question remaining out there is whether or not this breakthrough is just between Saudi Arabia and Qatar or whether it also involves the other Arab nations. Well, according to the reporting by Reuters and by the Associated Press, this may be a deal that's emerging between all of the parties, and that, in fact, tomorrow's signing ceremony, which we're still trying to learn more about in Saudi Arabia, will have Kushner in attendance. He'll be joined by Brian Hook, a U.S. State Department representative, another U.S. official as well, and that this signing agreement, it appears, may be more than just Saudi Arabia and Qatar. It may involve the other GCC nations as well. Again, this is still breaking. We're trying to get this confirmed, but what we know from the Reuters news agency is that Jared Kushner had a large part driving this effort. It is something that he was trying to race against the clock in finding some sort of resolution, given that President Trump will be out of office within 16 days. And to add this emerging deal, if it sticks, as one more victory diplomatically between the Trump administration negotiated in the Gulf region would certainly be something that the president can celebrate in his waning days in office.
I suppose, looking back on it, though, there was a part that President Trump played at the start of all this that perhaps some people might have said was unhelpful and encouraged the other countries to blockade.
That's right, and certainly that brings up the images of President Trump's first trip out of the U.S. as president. Of course, he chose Saudi Arabia as the destination, really cozying up to Saudi Arabia from the very first beginning days of his administration. Then, of course, there was the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi and President Trump's unwillingness to condemn Saudi Arabia, condemn the role of the Crown Prince, despite the U.S. intelligence conclusions that it was likely a directed operation coming from the Crown Prince himself. So certainly the president had faced much criticism over his response to Saudi Arabia, coming even from members of his own party, the Republicans. And we saw Congress throughout the years of the Trump administration, in their rare departures from President Trump, members of his party, again, the Republicans, voting in measures that were very critical of Saudi Arabia, its role in the war in Yemen. So to go from that point to the last 2 weeks of President Trump's administration, where he can call this a win, again, if the deal sticks, that was negotiated by his own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who long called peace in the Middle East his predominant goal in his role in the White House as a senior advisor. This is certainly something that the Trump administration will likely celebrate. We'll talk a lot about in the coming days.
Heidi Jocastro, thank you very much indeed for the time being, and I'm sure we'll talk to you again soon. In the meantime, Al Jazeera's Jamal Shayal is live for us from Doha. So, Jamal, for people who are just tuning in, give us a quick sense of what this deal involves and who has to give what.
Well, what it involves in terms of the commitments that will be taken by all sides is yet to be clear, and most likely we will not hear about it until the summit takes place itself. However, what we know what it won't involve. It won't involve the 13 demands that the blockading countries said must be met by Qatar in order for the blockade to be lifted. Those demands included cutting ties off with Iran, shutting down Al Jazeera, expelling Turkish military base here, and paying billions of dollars of compensation to those 4 countries. What's very clear in what's happened, and people will say, well, why, and the obvious question, why is there a breakthrough now if those demands aren't being met? There's been a shift in international players in terms of the new US administration that's on the brink of inauguration, in terms of the fact that Qatar has established that it has been able to survive over the past 3 years, not just survive, but actually its economy has been doing better than the 4 blockading countries. And therefore, the policies that have been pushed by that quartet have obviously failed. That, coupled with the constant push and efforts by Kuwait to try and find a solution, and the revived interest of US President Donald Trump's senior advisor and son-in-law Jared Kushner to maybe exit the White House with another diplomatic win as far as he's concerned, is what led us to where we are today. Speaking to people, not just in Qatar, but also in Kuwait and across the GCC, what I understand will take place tomorrow will focus more on an emphasis of the unity of the GCC, the need to bring about or re-establish a united front towards the different crises that they all face, not least COVID, which has been a major one that they've all suffered equally from, and also a kind of reaffirmation of the GCC's principles and a return to the mechanisms that already existed in it in order to find a solution. As far as the Saudis are concerned, and this is why so far the only airspace that will be open or has been announced to be open is Saudi Arabia, they are maybe in I wouldn't say a better position, but a less worse position than the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and the Egyptians, because of the geopolitical nature that they find themselves in as the custodians of the 2 holy shrines, or as the self-proclaimed leaders of the Muslim world. They can always fall back on that as a reason why they are going to be the quote-unquote bigger person and find a way to reunite things.
Jamal, just you mentioned in passing Iran and how that sort of played into this whole dispute. What do you think the future is for the relations between the countries in that area and Iran?
Well, I mean, it's a relationship that's been hot and cold, and to a great extent, actually, a lot of the times has been kind of very confusing, because you find, for example, the blockading countries demanding from Qatar to cut ties with Iran. But one of the blockading countries, namely the United Arab Emirates, does business in the trade volume between Abu Dhabi and Tehran is tenfold greater than that of Doha and Iran. There have been senior UAE officials that have gone to Tehran over the past year in a bid to try and maybe find a different approach towards it. That's one of the differences between, for example, the UAE and Saudi Arabia in terms of foreign policy. It's also been obviously one of the differences between both those countries and Qatar, which has tried to always play a mediating role, as well as, for example, Oman, which was one of the countries that paved the way for the Iranian nuclear deal, as well as other negotiations with Tehran. In terms of looking forward to it, a couple of weeks ago, the Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran was in Doha. No doubt discussions would have taken place, or at least he would have been given some sort of visibility as to the discussions taking place to find a solution to the GCC crisis. But ultimately, this crisis will, or this resolution to the crisis will be seen detached from the individual relationships between each country and Iran, because one of the key talking points that the Qatari officials have been making throughout the past 3 years is that the blockade was being imposed on them to try and enforce or strip them, rather, of their independence and their sovereignty in making or pursuing specific foreign policies. And therefore, it wouldn't make sense for them to accept any sort of dictation as to how they would deal with Iran or any other country for that matter in order to resolve the issue.
Tell us a bit about the GCC now that, well, it appears that this big dispute is on course of being resolved at any rate. Does the GCC have a new position or a kind of new power in the region? I mean, in the past it's been criticised for not having enough influence or not perhaps making big enough decisions on crises or conflicts. Well, how do you see the future of the GCC if this particular issue is resolved?
Well, if we're to look at the wider Middle East and North Africa region, the GCC is probably the most functioning bloc between them. So the League of Arab States, or the Arab League, has been one that many have criticized for failing to do anything on any front. The GCC at least had certain things like visa waiver between the countries, had economic privileges, often negotiated trade deals and so forth as a bloc, and therefore there was some sort of a benefit to it. Politically speaking, when it came to issues of pursuing specific policies, particularly when it came to international events, that's where it had a problem. Obviously, we're reporting on the facts, right? The fact is that these are countries that don't see eye to eye on issues. Also, if we're to be blunt about describing any possible solution that will take place tomorrow, the reality is it's not really going to solve the deep-seated issues between these countries, because each country is built on a different political system and has a different outlook. Qatar is a lot more pluralistic in its approach. It's a lot more open to diversity and to different of opinions, and deals with countries from Iran to Israel in the past, right? Whereas the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain and Egypt have consistently pursued more unilateral policies, have supported consistently authoritarian regimes, either military ones like the one in Egypt or in Libya, or absolute monarchies. And therefore that hasn't changed. So if you are to follow the analysis that the core of the issue is that difference of opinion, particularly when we're looking at it post-Arab Spring, then really all that's being happening is you're putting a plaster on a gushing wound. But that is enough, at least, for many people in the region, because the stability that came from the GCC, even if it was fractured behind the scenes, was still something that is worth maintaining, as opposed to having yet another divided and fractured segment of the Middle East and North Africa.
Jamal, thank you very much indeed for the time being. Now let's bring in Rami Khouri, who's the Director of Global Engagement and a Senior Public Policy Fellow at the American University of Beirut. Joins us via Skype from New York. Hopefully your line will stay stable this time. Now listen, I wanted to ask you about where this puts the Biden administration and its future relations, say, with Iran. Does this complicate the task for Biden in how to deal with Iran? The fact that this situation is being resolved?
I don't think so. I think it probably is a positive element. The Arab countries in the Arab region and the ones in the Gulf and the GCC don't have a unified position on Iran. Some of them want to use forceful sanctions and threats and put military options on the table. Other ones want to have quiet diplomacy. But reducing the tensions between the GCC countries and Qatar will definitely be a positive step. And the question of Iran is going to depend much more on what people decide in Washington and maybe a little bit in Israel, because Israel drives a lot of Washington policy on this. That's going to be the determining factor. But Qatar and Kuwait and Oman have good relations with Iran, trading. They talk, they're in contact all the time, and that's a very positive thing. The genesis of this conflict between the blockade, because it's not really a two-way conflict, but the genesis was the Saudis and the Emiratis were terrified after the Arab uprisings of 2010, 2011 about trends in the region. Democracy, voting, leaders being thrown out, open media like Jazeera and others. But they were also worried about the United States starting to negotiate with Iran and the U.S. pulling out of the region. So having a sensible, logical, political dialogue between Iran and the Arab countries is the only way to do this. And you've had some Saudis and Emiratis and others behind the scenes talking to Iranians, so we'll have to wait and see. There's also a new factor here, which is some countries possibly, without naming any because we don't know, this is speculation, but some Arab countries may feel that their links with Israel may give them more comfort in terms of dealing with Iran. If the U.S. is slowly downgrading its role in the region, which it may or may not be, but the links with Israel are also a new factor that we have to put into this situation. But the real driver of this whole boycott issue was the United Arab Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed, the crown prince and effective ruler of the UAE, rather than the Saudis. The Bahrainis and the Egyptians went along with it because they basically gained a lot of material things and a sense of sort of a role in the region. But the Saudis are much more sensitive to the damage that has been done to their reputation because of this, because of the blockade, because of the war in Yemen, because of the internal factors that they've dealt with in terms of repression. So the Saudis are much more sensitive to international opinion. The Emiratis are much more forceful and decisive. And we don't know the relationship between them right now. It seems to be evolving. And we haven't heard anything about the Emiratis opening their border or doing anything. So we have to really wait to get more information about what is the result of this reconciliation or reduction in tension, opening of some borders. But it's a positive move. Everybody should welcome it. And people should not repeat such foolhardy unilateral blockades that are based on political differences that translate into acts of almost irrational political violence.
Now, Tommy, you mentioned there that in passing the normalisation of relations between some Gulf countries with Israel. Give us an idea of whether this actually, some of that might be tied to this, and in what way?
Well, it might be. The Emiratis have established normal relations, and some of them are enthusiastic about economic ties. Of course, we don't know what the Emirati people feel about this. The likelihood is not all Emiratis are happy with this. We know that around the entire Arab region, somewhere around 70 to 80% of the population of the Arab countries don't want to normalize with Israel until Israel has a fair peace with the Palestinians. Then everybody's willing to normalize. The Arab peace plan is based on normal relations with Israel, which came out of Saudi Arabia and the Arab summit years ago. But we don't know what average people around the region think. The normalization is a logistical, mutually beneficial agreement between individual leaders in Bahrain, in the UAE, in Morocco. Sudan, even the whole government isn't behind the normalization or the steps towards normalization. The military side wants to do it, the political side in Sudan doesn't. So these are very delicate, limited depth logistical arrangements rather than peace breaking out or anything like that. The interesting thing here also is the announcement for this came out of Kuwait, not out of Washington, as far as I can tell, though things may have changed in the last 15 minutes. The United States wants to play this up as a big deal, and Jared Kushner is trying to take a lot of credit for it. The likelihood is that the Omanis and the Kuwaitis did most of the heavy lifting in terms of discussions and how to get this resolved. But again, we just have to wait for the details. These things are not completely clear, right? The details are not completely clear right now. This may be a limited but significant first step towards reducing the tensions and eventually getting back to normal relations. But normal relations, as your correspondent said, mean that different Gulf countries have different policies. They're different in their economic weight, their ideology, the nature of their leadership, their relationship to open societies and closed societies. They're very, very different from each other. They've never had a strong, unified position on anything political, really. And even when they did, say, on Palestine, they just broke it because they thought they had things to benefit. So it has never been a major political bloc, but it has been a functioning technical collaboration among these 6 like-minded countries, which started at a moment in the 1970s when I'm old enough to remember when it started, and it was very much seen as a Arab rich person's club to protect the wealth of the Arab Gulf region that suddenly boomeranged or mushroomed in the 70s when oil prices increased, and people saw the GCC as a way for the Gulf countries to kind of protect their wealth, and it never had any real political weight and has much less now. There's another danger here. The UAE and the Saudis, especially the UAE, may suffer what the Trump administration has suffered, which is a drop in trust internationally. People might say, well, I can't make a deal with this country because they'll just break it unilaterally, like Trump did with different, climate change and other things. And the Emiratis and Saudis just unilaterally broke the relations with Qatar, boycotted them, started the war in Yemen. And this kind of unilateral, impulsive, often violent behavior, whether it's military or just political violence, this is a problem for many countries because others will look twice before making agreements with them in the future.
Rami Khouri, thank you very much indeed for your analysis.